Thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It is really very, very exciting. This is my first time to South Africa, my first time to Cape Town, and I must say I'm very impressed. I'm also impressed by the fact that we have gathered 110 industry professionals for this event, and I think even in an international perspective, that is really quite an achievement, so congratulations with that. As already mentioned, my name is Andreas Andersen. I've been working in this industry for almost 20 years, 15, 16, 17 years. I started out as a young lawyer with a keen interest in roller coasters. And since I got my first job at Tivoli Gardens back in 1999, I haven't really looked back. Although my mother still from time to time asks me when I will get a real job. This coming presentation will build further on the presentation that my colleague Karen Staley from IAAPA did at last year's conference. And it really has three parts. I will start with an attempt of drawing up a picture of the global attractions industry. I will thereafter present some of the primary drivers growing and changing this global world map. And lastly, I will summarize some of the learnings that I have made navigating this industry of rapid change. It's totally subjective, but on the other hand also universal, as they apply to both Sweden and South Africa. But before I do so, I will shortly present the two organizations I represent here today, Liseberg and IAAPA. I have to get this to work. There we go. If we start with Liseberg, this is one of the oldest amusement parks in Europe. The modern Liseberg amusement park was founded in connection with a large industrial exhibition, a World's Fair in 1923. But the park itself has its origins in a manor called, well, Liseberg, meaning Lise's Mountain, built in 1754. But since 1923, the park has developed from being a fairground to becoming an amusement and theme park. And on the same journey, the park has gone from being a rather regional event to becoming, as already mentioned, the biggest tourist attraction in Sweden and a destination in its own right, with more than 3 million visitors every year, 3,000 employees, and a turnover of about 140 million euros. I'm also here representing IAAPA, the International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions. IAAPA was founded in 1918 in Chicago, and the aim was, and I'm quoting here, to form a true business association for the amusement park industry dedicated to cooperation, mutual welfare, educational objectives, and protection against unjust taxation, as it was written in the first set of bylaws. And to begin with, the association was entirely American, but in the 1930s, the first international members came on board, and in 1972, the I, standing for international, was added to the Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions, making IAAPA the first global association representing the attractions industry. Today, IAAPA represents more than 5,000 members worldwide, of which 1,300 are from Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And as has been mentioned, we actually changed the name of IAAPA Europe to IAAPA EMEA, and we're probably going to change it later this year to reflect the fact that we're not just an association covering Europe and the Middle East, but also Africa. But I'll come back to that a little bit later. The association represents all types of attractions, although fixed site amusement and theme parks are still the core of the membership. And this is also why that today's presentation is somewhat centered around these types of facilities. But it has an explanation that we simply know the most about this constituency. IAAPA's activities are to serve the membership by, and again I'm quoting, promote safe operations, global development, professional growth, and commercial success of the attractions industry, as formulated in the mission statement. This is done through gathering and distribution of data, education and training, creating meeting places for the industry at expos and events, and promoting the industry's interests to legislators and media. But what is this attractions industry, you might ask? And I think we've actually discussed it already this morning. It's a really good question, and it is not entirely simple to answer that question. As with most sub-industries within the tourism sector, the attractions industry is characterized by being very diversified and somewhat dispersed. This also means that the industry in general is not very data-driven. Tomorrow you'll hear a keynote from Yael Kaufman from LTP, and she's going to tell you something else. But keep this in mind: we're not very good on data in this industry, and I have a few examples to illustrate that. Yael is very good with data, but that's a different story. And in its turn, this actually has the consequences that it's actually very difficult to paint a global picture of the attractions industry as a whole. However, we do know some things. For example, we know that there are approximately 2,000 amusement parks around the world. How to define an amusement park becomes more and more tricky. I'll come back to that a little bit later. But the 2,000 number is a pretty good estimate. Here I've listed the top 10 parks on a global scale, which again illustrates that we know a ton about the bigger parks, but not very much about all the smaller players in the industry. The same applies to water parks. This is a growing industry, but very poorly organized. The World Water Park Association does a great job in North America, while the European Water Park Association is organizing most German operators. But again, there's very little global data available. The same can be said about the museum constituency. According to Museums of the World, there are about 55,000 museums worldwide in 202 countries. And the International Council of Museums comprises of 30,000 members in 137 countries. But again, very little data to illustrate the economic and cultural importance of this sector. The same is the case with zoos and aquariums. We have fantastic associations representing this constituency on both global, regional, and national scales. We have the World Zoo Association, the World Zoo and Aquarium Association, we have the European Association, we have the American Zoos Association, and they all do an amazing job when it comes to animal preservation and education, but they're less focused on the business side of things. And this means that we have very little data on animal attractions in general. To summarize, there are a lot of things we don't know when it comes to the global attractions industry. We don't know the number of attractions, the annual visitation, we don't know the revenue or the number of employees. And this is a huge issue because we actually don't know what the economic impact of the attractions industry is. And first and foremost, we know almost nothing about emerging markets. For example, the market we're in today. And this is not good because when we talk to legislators around the world, we need to be able to demonstrate the importance of attractions to tourism in general. As it was mentioned just earlier, people do not travel to travel, they travel to experience. And as such, you can say that the attractions industry in many ways is the engine of the overall tourism industry. But even though there are a lot of things we don't know, there are also things we do know, especially when it comes to amusement and theme parks. For example, we do know that the global growth is very uneven and that market shares are shifting. We see rather limited growth in North America and Europe, while we see an expanding industry in Middle East, Africa, and Asia. We also see a general consolidation, and we could also say professionalization of the attractions industry. The corporate groups are leading the pack when it comes to growth, and we see new groups operating more than one attraction, being set up every year. At the same time, we're also seeing market shares shifting between these groups. Disney has lost a little traction with, for example, Universal Studios and some of the Chinese groups growing a lot the last few years. If we take a closer look at, let's see if I can get this to work. No. There it was. I just have to point at myself. If we take a closer look at amusement and theme parks and the latest forecasts from IAAPA, you'll see this uneven growth globally, with Asia and Middle East and North Africa really seeing the highest forecast growth rates in the coming years, with about 30%. But again, we only have the north part of the African continent covered by these reports, and not the central or southern part of Africa, which is actually where we're expecting to see a lot of growth in years to come. It's not working. If we zoom in on one region, which we actually know a lot about, Europe, a few figures can illustrate my point about how valuable data can be when communicating with government officials and the media. And it's also, important for our self-esteem as an industry. For example, we know that Europe has, maybe I just have a chip point in my head. Oh, yeah, it works every time. We know that sorry, now I'm a little bit too yeah. We know that the economic impact of the attractions industry is huge, as Donald Trump would say. About 10 billion euros in total, with a 600 million euro capex every year, and more than 1.2. I'm flipping over here. We know that we have 300 amusement parks in Europe, 150 million visitors. These parks represent a turnover of 5 billion euros and employ more than 50,000 people. We know that the economic impact of these attractions are about 10 billion euros in total, with 600 million euros in capex every year, and more than 1.2 billion euros in paid taxes. If we add other types of attractions, zoos and aquariums, water parks, commercial museums, etc., we can more than double these figures. But what drives these numbers, and what drives the overall growth of the global attractions industry? This is, of course, a complex question to answer. But in this second part of the presentation, I will try to present some of the most important drivers of this change, and also of the growth of the industry in general. First of all, we have to understand that we are operating in a global marketplace. This is, of course, more apparent in some regions than others, but still, we do no longer compete just with attractions up the road, but attractions all over the place. A transparent marketplace through the World Wide Web and social media, and increased mobility through low-cost airlines, has changed the attractions industry from being almost solely regional or locally focused to becoming a much more dynamic global industry. You can say that the roller coasters we built are compared with what guests can experience in Orlando. The animal exhibits we present will be compared with exhibits in Singapore, and the service we provide will be compared with what the guest experienced in Dubai. You can say that the marketplace is merging into a giant integral web of heightened or higher expectations. As an example of this globalized marketplace is Tivoli in Copenhagen, the park where I started my career in 1999. In 1996, 15% of the guests at Tivoli did not have a Danish passport. Last year, the same number was 29%. Sweden and Norway are, of course, big markets, but North America and especially Asia and Middle East are increasingly important. If we stay in Denmark, we can take a look at one of the other trends shaping the attractions industry these years, and that is resort building. In other words, the fact that typically amusement parks, but also to some extent now zoos, are building accommodation and packaging their products to accommodate the growing short breaks market. This example is Legoland in Billund, home of the Lego brick and the first Legoland that was ever built. Over the last 15 years, they have almost doubled their attendance by building accommodation in and near the park. And today, they have more than 9,000 beds in conjunction with the park, which is quite impressive, taking into account that far less than 20,000 people live in Billund. Legoland has, in other words, created one of Europe's leading family destinations in a place which might very well be the most boring city in Scandinavia. Quite impressive and a little scary when you're actually competing with these guys. Another well-known example is, of course, the Disney parks around the world. This one is Disneyland Paris with about 6,000 hotel rooms on site, and now adding another 1,800 units over the next few years in what they call Village Nature. And the dynamic of adding accommodation was once explained to me by a Disney executive. He explained that what we all know, that when you add a big attraction to your lineup, especially in amusement parks, you'll experience increased attendance in year one, statistically about 10% in year one, which will then drop off with, let's say, 2-3% every year in the years to come. And again, that means you'll have to start a new investment cycle after, let's say, 4 or 5 years. This formula does, however, not apply to accommodation. When you invest in accommodation, your revenues increase in year one, and they tend not to drop off. It is therefore a much more consistent investment strategy for parks moving down this particular road. One of the parks that has taken this road and refined it more than anyone else is the IAAPA Park in Rust, Germany. The park opened in 1975 as a showcase for the Mack company building amusement rides. Today, the park has more than 5 million visitors, making it the second best visited park in Europe after the just mentioned Disneyland Paris. But what is even more impressive is that IAAPA Park is by far one of the most profitable parks in the European industry, not at least due to the fact that they have 6 on-site hotels and campsites. A resort that in 2018-19 will be expanded with additionally 4 hotels and a large indoor water park. To give you an idea of the quality of this place, I have a short film presenting the park. It has a very, very American narration, but it has super pretty pictures, so I hope you'll live with me.
We've used countless tons of steel. We've drawn innumerable sketches and then made them real. From natural raw materials, we have shaped true masterpieces. We've roasted tons of popcorn. Thousands of brushes have brilliantly decorated our walls. We've sewn more than 10,000 costumes and changed more than 5 million bed linens. We have installed more than 5,000 seats for all the arenas and stages that mean the world. True legends have left their marks here. Each day brings new challenges and invites us to create something unique. To give our world a little more color, more adrenaline, more poetry. Each day, new dreams are born. In over 3 decades, we have never stopped being visionaries. And there are very simple reasons for that. We want to amaze people. And enchant them. To move them. Whether at 130 kilometers per hour or at 13. By the way, our trains are always on time, so you won't lose a second of your wonderful day, because that would be a pity. Here, almost anything is possible. Except boredom. Welcome to IAAPA Park.
Indeed, a very, very impressive park, and an interesting case when it comes to this trend of building a true destination. The IAAPA Park is located far from anything. It's in the middle of the countryside, but even with that location, they're actually getting more than 5 million visitors every year. Another very important trend shaping our industry these years is the use of IP. It worked. In other words, the use of brands, whether licensed in or the attraction's own brands, to enhance and expand the experience. We all know Disney's ability to move IP from platform to platform. You know, films becoming rides, or rides becoming films, characters becoming merchandise, merchandise being the focal point of communication, etc., etc. I think Disney has the unofficial world championship in this particular exercise. But Disney is also getting rivaled in this sport. You have probably all read what Harry Potter did to Universal Studios in Orlando. 40% more guests in 2011, 40%, when the Harry Potter experience opened. Now opening in Universal Studios Hollywood, this park could actually give the neighboring Disney resort some pretty stiff competition if all goes as forecasted. But it's not just amusement or theme parks that use IP. A fun little example is a small zoo in southern Sweden called Skånes djurpark, a small animal park which in a few weeks will open a Shaun the Sheepland, which is kind of clever. I mean, and a bit of a crossover for a park that traditionally has been more focused on animals than entertainment. Another interesting example is the new Louvre Museum, designed by Jean Nouvel, opening in Abu Dhabi later this year. The city of Abu Dhabi has paid 400 million euros for the Louvre brand, and an additional 600 million euros will be paid in exchange for loans of artwork from the museum in Paris. So it's not just amusement parks that actually is jumping on this IP train. Another trend which I've touched upon earlier is the consolidation of the industry. In other words, corporate groups that buy or build parks, zoos, aquariums, as well as midway attractions, and operate these within corporate structures. This example is Merlin, with more than 110 attractions around the world. This is one of the more prominent players, corporate players in the industry. These corporate groups are global players with global brands and global financial muscles. And they very often change the market situation where they operate. And this because of that a corporate group has a bit of a different perspective than a privately owned attraction. And the reason for this is that a capital fund, when they buy up attractions, they will, the minute they buy, also start thinking about when to sell. This means that short-term cash flow and volume growth becomes much more important than long-term value. In its turn, it means that discounting, marketing, and other initiatives that drives the gate becomes very important. And I know you're going to talk more about this later today and also tomorrow. Staying with Merlin, one of the brands they own is Madame Tussauds. And this leads me into the next trend, and that is the building of what we call midway attractions. Madame Tussauds has been rolled out with venues all over the world, and these so-called midway attractions are smaller indoor attractions on high streets with an average 1 to 2 hour stay. The same strategy as with Madame Tussauds has been applied with the Legoland brand, transitioning these into what they call Legoland Discovery Centers and shopping malls and on high street. And it's actually quite interesting that most of Merlin's growth has actually come from these smaller midway attractions and not from their bigger theme or amusement parks. This diversified approach to growth leads into the next trend, namely the fact that attractions becomes hybrids. We all borrow from each other. Museums use theming and storytelling. Theme parks includes animals, zoos adds rides, and so on. This example is Chimelong Ocean Kingdom in China. And you can really not tell whether this park is a theme park, an amusement park, or a zoo. Another example is the very well-known SeaWorld parks around the world that includes rides, animal exhibits, and shows, and it has been doing so for more than 40 years. This hybridization makes it troublesome for nerds like me or data nerds like Yael to really categorize and set these attractions apart, but it can also create identity problems, as in the case of SeaWorld. But that's a different story and a different presentation. Another trend driving the industry is the growth in tourism and travel. Governments in most countries actively promote tourism, and in a number of countries, particularly in Asia and Middle East, theme parks are viewed as a key element in national plans. In Malaysia, for example, the government established a fund to attract and even directly invest in theme parks to develop the tourism industry. In China, the government in 2013 removed the ban of approvals for new parks, which is leading to a surge in new projects with more than 50 parks currently in the pipeline. And with Disneyland Resort Shanghai opening I think it's 2 weeks out. A key to growth is, of course, also investments. And the attractions industry is a capital-intensive industry. If you look at the general benchmarks, amusement and theme parks has to reinvest approximately 10 to 12% of their turnover every year just to stay in the business. This example is Kolmården, a medium-sized zoo operating outside Stockholm. They're opening a new roller coaster next week, and this is part of a 30 million euro investment over a 2-year period. and this in the park with approximately 500,000 visitors. And by the way, an example of this crossover or hybridization trend I just mentioned. I actually have a film with me to show some of the investments that was made in Europe the last year, but in view of Ernie's fine system, I think we're going to skip that film just to keep time. Another trend shaping our industry these years is digitalization. We all operate in a marketplace which becomes more and more digital. It influences all aspects of our business. The digital work influences how we communicate with our guests. The time when it was enough to just buy print ads and TV commercials are long gone. What happens in social media is equally as important as what is taking place on traditional platforms. I think you have a presentation later today about this. The digital world influences how we develop our products, even though the base product, the base experience product is an analog one. The digital integrates into apps, tracking solutions, and queue entertainment at a speed that is increasing all the time. The digital world influences the competitive environment. A few years ago, a survey was done amongst German amusement parks where they asked teenagers what the primary competition to amusement parks was. And they expected that these German teenagers would say, well, it is to go to the cinema or visit a restaurant. But the primary competition in amusement parks was this baby, the mobile phone. So we're all competing on a completely different arena today. And the digital world influences how we sell and distribute our products. More and more is moving into digital platforms. In general, you can say that the new digital world has the characteristics of being fast, transparent, agile, complex, customer-driven, collaborative, and unfortunately, very unpredictable. And it is this unpredictability which can sometimes make us as operators freak out, because the fact that all our business models can and will be challenged in this new digital age. And I think we're all looking for these game changers that can wipe away an entire industry almost overnight. A few examples can illustrate. If we look at digital sales at Liseberg, it has been exploding the last few years. We are looking at almost an exponential growth in what we sell in our web shop, a trend that has continued also in 2016. Another dimension of the digitalization of sales is the introduction of dynamic pricing, and another subject you'll touch upon tomorrow, I think. We all know that how we pay different prices for hotels, train tickets and airfares depending on demand. This will most likely also be implemented in the attractions industry in the years to come. This example is from Slagharen in the Netherlands that has been applying dynamic pricing for a couple of years. Another example is Disney World in Orlando, which has actually just started to yield the prices depending on demand. This tool can of course be used to maximize profits, but it's actually also a good tool to adhere to different visitor groups with different price elasticities. As Sabine mentioned, I think we all operate in environments where we are both dependent on a regional market or local market and the incoming tourism, and they can have very different price perceptions, a different price elasticity, and this dynamic pricing can actually cater, with dynamic pricing you can actually cater to both groups. Digitalization is also affecting the actual product. This example is Disney Magic Bands, a planning tool, a room key. You can pay with this wristband that you get when you check into your hotel at one of the Disney World properties in Orlando. This represents an $800 million investment in software and hardware. But it's also an example of how fast things move. The day that the Disney Magic Band was introduced were also the day it was technologically dated. It was old-fashioned. At Shanghai Disney Resort opening next week, the Disney Magic Band has been replaced by, again, mobile phones, with this much smaller investment in infrastructure. Another example of how the digital is implemented in the actual product design is taken from my home park, Liseberg. I have a short film to illustrate.
Helix is the latest addition to Sweden's biggest amusement park, Liseberg. It's the greatest attraction investment ever, and one of the most spectacular roller coasters in the world. There's really only one problem. Queues. Long queues. So what could we do for our patient guests? We couldn't make the line shorter, but could we make it seem shorter? Could we make waiting in line fun? We based our idea on the huge interest in gaming and created a new interactive and social experience, the world's first synchronized queue entertainment. But it wasn't just entertainment. The mobile game also gave you the chance to avoid standing in line. You could practice anywhere, but in order to compete, you had to be in the queue. And you played against everybody else simultaneously. The mini-games were all based on different elements of the new roller coaster. Every 15 minutes, the player with the highest score won, and could then use the VIP passage. After the ride, you could log your ride to collect achievements. Finally, waiting in line is actually fun.
Last week, we launched a new app. We launched a new app supporting an attraction which we opened in April called Aerospin. And again, it's queue entertainment, and it's a very powerful social media tool as well. I was testing this game for 2 months, and I never made it past the first round, which is sort of embarrassing, but also tells something about my age, I guess. This brings me to the next trend shaping my industry, and that is conceptualization, storytelling, and theming. It is no longer enough to place a ride on a piece of asphalt and then expect people to come. You have to package it, you have to tell a story, you have to create emotions. This example is Aerospin, the mentioned new ride at Liseberg this year. The text on the following film is in Swedish, but you'll get the point. We skip the film, I think. There we go. This is a pretty basic ride, but the packaging, the story about the first Swedish flight pioneers and the link to Liseberg's history is actually quite refined. And it is, frankly, necessary to build interest. Another way of packaging an existing product is the last trend I'm going to mention today, new seasons. In 1996, the first European Christmas market at an amusement park was opened at Tivoli in Copenhagen. 5 years later, in 2001, this particular Christmas market had more than 1 million visitors and has been copied all over the world. The last few years, Halloween has been the craze in our industry, also at Liseberg. A short video, not for the faint of hearted, can illustrate this product. We tested Halloween for the first time in 2015. We expected 80,000 guests over a week. We got more than 200,000. And it's an example of how to take an existing infrastructure, packaging it in a new way and reaching new target groups. And I think we're going to see a lot more of these seasonal events in the years to come. This summarizes some of the primary drivers of growth, at least from my perspective. Much has been left out, but the list gives you a pretty good overview of some of the trends changing the world map of the attractions industry. But how do you navigate this changing world map? Well, from my perspective, there are a few golden rules that will help. And it sort of summarizes summary of the learnings I have made the last 20 years. Again, totally subjective. I'm trying to get this thing to work. There we go. But applicable to all types of attractions and regions. First of all, my tip to you is learn from your peers. Attend conferences like this one, be part of networks, use the resources at hand. IAAPA has huge amounts of resources and industry data and benchmarks you as a member can tap into, and you should. The reason why I say this is because we all run businesses in a very specialized industry, and very often in isolation. You can't just drive up the road and benchmark against another plumber or another retail store. It's a tad more complicated for us working in the attractions industry. Therefore, use networks like this one to learn from your colleagues' successes and from your colleagues' missteps. Second, be yourself and be authentic. Joe Pine, the inventor of the modern day notion of the experience economy, he wrote a book a few years ago called Authenticity, and he uses this quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet as a starting point for this analysis. I won't go into details about the way he approaches this notion of authenticity, but there are really two dimensions of authenticity. One is being true to yourself, which is very self-directed. Two is other-directed, being what you say you are to others. And I think it's very, very true. Be who you are, be original, be aware of your company's DNA, and build on this. 3, speaking of this DNA, you need to be consistent. It is important to know who you are and let that be expressed in your strategies. Strong brands, they are consistent. They know why they exist. They're good at defining their DNA. They're good at expressing that in a strategy. They are good at conceptualizing their strategy in a product design, experience design, and they're good at communicating this DNA in their marketing. But first and foremost, they're also good at turning their staff into brand ambassadors. They're consistent. They have this red thread all the way through. And speaking of brand ambassadors, I love this quote from Walt Disney, classic quote. He once said, "You need to treat your employees the way you want them to treat your guests." And I think that's also very, very true. As service companies, employees are the key to our success. In the late 90s, a management model called the service profit chain was developed. And according to this model, successful companies have one characteristic in common. They all have happy and content employees. Based on this observation, a model was established, and it really stated that if you want profitability and growth, you need loyal customers or guests. Loyal customers and guests is always a product of service quality. Service quality in its turn is a product of employee productivity and retention, which in its turn is a product of employee satisfaction. So to make it very short, if you want to grow and make a profit, you need happy guests. And to get happy guests, you need happy employees. This employee focus is super important, but can never override the fact that we always have to remember why we're here. A few years ago, I read a book by a guy called Mike Coleman. He was one of the keynotes at a big educational event we just had in Europe in And he's writing about successful service companies. And when I wrote this book, I had some moments of clarity, because what he describes in this book is something which is very, very characteristic for our industry. We think that we sell products. You know, we sell entrance tickets, we sell merchandise, we sell candy floss and F&B. But what we sell is actually not what the guest is buying. The guest is buying expectations, experiences, emotions, memories. It is an emotional product. And if we forget that, we're lost, to quote Mike Holm. We always have to think outside in, not inside out. We need to focus on our guests. This brings me to the second last point of this navigation list. Think long term. Why do I say this? Well, because this has become a bit of a rarity in our industry, which is weird because successful attractions always think long term. I talked earlier about the consolidation of the industry and how the capital fund-owned attractions are more focused on the next quarter earnings than the long-term success of the business. This is hugely damaging, in my opinion, because the success of tomorrow is always determined by our actions today. At Liseberg, we try to never think long-term because we know we have Liseberg on loan from future generations. And for me, this is very powerful, and one of the reasons why I work at a medium-sized regional park in Western Sweden and not in one of the big corporate groups. The last point on my navigation list is be brave. This may be a bit high-flying, but I really think that when you work with consumer products or consumer experiences in a highly volatile and ever-changing market, you need to be brave enough to change, to develop, to invest. A famous Danish philosopher, Søren Kierkegaard, once wrote, "To be brave is to lose your footings a short moment. To not be brave is to lose yourself." And I believe this is very, very true. If we, as an industry, as attractions professionals, are not agile, adaptable, and willing to take risk, there is the risk, or the even higher risk, that we will not be relevant tomorrow. So my tips for you is learn from your peers, be yourself, be consistent, think outside in, create ambassadors, plan long term, and be brave. And I know I'm painting with very broad strokes here, but I think it can be a good thing to take the helicopter view once in a while. And I know that we will dive into much more details today and tomorrow on some of the subjects I have mentioned here, from pricing strategies over digital storytelling to soft programming and revenue management. Thank you so much for your attention, and thank you so much for inviting me.